Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that very overly generous introduction. I'm possibly, well, I'm an economist by background, so probably, I mean, we have a slight affinity, but I'm probably unusual in the room in that the way I come at these topics is really from a well-functioning of the market and an environmental externalities point of view, but not just about studying them and understanding how bad pollution can be, but also trying to bring about solutions and market-based solutions. And I think, speaking, personally, here is, I think over the last generation, we've been through a period where the basic approach to environmental regulation, environmental improvement, has been to ban bad things and sponsor and subsidize things that are seen as good. And we're now really seeing the limits of that approach. If nothing else, it is too prone to lobbying by vested interests. And where that lobbying it's about the strength of the lobbying and how well funded the lobbyers are, rather than looking at what actually are the real world benefits of the product and creating a market solution for scaling and propagating whatever the good solutions are. So we're here in a room, and we've heard yesterday, and we will today, I'm sure, hear lots of really good potential solutions to decarbonize the fuel chain, to reduce the usage, in-use emissions. But really, the question is, how can we actually catalyze the market? How can we actually demonstrate the benefits? How can we actually weed out the ones that don't work really well and make sure we don't put too much money into those? So what I wanted to share with you today is sort of an overview of how we view this. We are slightly unusual in that we are an independent test house, but we're not an independent test house which just does testing confidentially for clients. We do that, but we also do a lot of testing in our own right, where we will go and get various products, fuels, plastics, whole vehicles, tires, and we will test them ourselves, and we will publish the results. So that is our commitment. We fund that ourselves completely independently, and that is part of our contribution to trying to catalyze the best end answers, to catalyze the market. So I'm going to do it, as the title suggests. I'm going to sort of express what we do through the lens of how we test the chemical composition of a range of alternative biofuels, but also put that together. So not just what's in the fuels, but when you burn them in an engine, what happens in terms of the in-use tailpipe emissions as well. And I put this forward, as I said, as a lens. This is not the totality of what we do. There are lots of other ways we apply the same analytical techniques, but I thought it would be a really good way of showing how the issues we have in creating different biofuels, but also the impacts they have when they are used. So I hope you forgive that slight sort of reflective introduction, but I think hopefully that will put where I'm coming from in a better context, and hopefully you'll find the data interesting. So, and these slides, by the way, if I assume the organisers will make them available, but if anyone would like copies of them afterwards, I'm very happy to provide them. So emissions analytics, so it's my company that I set up in 2011. We are HQ'd in the UK, but we now have increasing operations around the world. And actually, since very recently, we're setting up an operation in Singapore as well. And interesting, there's lots of activity in the Australian market at the moment. Australia is is both now cracking down on its tailpipe emissions, but also is a major producer of fuels of different sorts. So essentially, we operate wherever the activity is, we can go there. And as I said, we're completely independent, and this sometimes dismays people when we say that actually that great thing doesn't actually work very well, but equally we can pull really good products that are under promoted, and that's our mission. Now, Cumulatively so far, we've tested over 2,500 different vehicles and machines. So that's where we have actually gone and acquired that vehicle or machine, generator, whatever it is, and we've tested it ourselves. So that over light duty, vans, trucks, diggers, cranes. If it burns liquid fuel, we will have tested it. Anything short of really large marine vessels, that's really the where we haven't focused thus far. But that is a big body of data that we've tested, and we own that data as well. We more latterly have addressed ourselves to possibly, or to the outside, the least sexiest subject in the world. But which actually, when you get into it, turns out to be one of the most interesting subjects in the world, which is vehicle tires. And I promise not to talk to you about tires over lunch, but trust me, they are extremely chemically and physically interesting. We are also interested, and rather analogous to what Magnus was talking about, vehicle interior air quality is actually a fascinating area for us as well. The vehicle interior, because vehicles are so well built these days, they are sealed. So you sit in a chemical chamber, and an average modern passenger car contains 7 kilograms of glue when it's first manufactured. We no longer rivet cars together, we glue them together. And that 7 kilos of glue has got to go somewhere. So in the, okay, some of it does off gas to the outside, but quite a lot of it, all the carpets and the dashboard and everything is glued together. That glue comes off into the interior of the cabin, particularly in the first year of ownership, and you are sitting in a mobile chemical chamber. So that's of interest to us as well. So you can see we do have quite a vehicle-centric view of the world. That is true. And we work with everyone. So I guess as evidence to our independence, we work with everyone from vehicle manufacturers, fuel producers, right down to operators, fleets, even end consumers sometimes. And we don't just plow our own furrow. I am also chairman of a couple of standardization workshops. 90 was on tailpipe emissions for NOx emissions, and 103 was on vehicle interior air quality. And I do that partly through my role at Imperial College in London. Anyway, enough about me. What I'm going to show this morning is the challenge that fuel and developing alternative fuels, biofuel presents, the test methodology that we use, and then look at some renewable diesel, renewable gasoline results, both regulated emissions and crucially unregulated emissions too, and then see what that means for how that helps us interpret the chemical composition of these fuels, but crucially also how it can be a route to understanding the provenance of the fuels. Because without wanting to give away the punchline, there are a whole bunch of fuels out there with great sounding eco credentials, but there's also a lot of fraud out there too. And what we don't want to happen is some really promising markets for biofuels to be scuppered because of abuse by certain, arbitrage between the elevated price of alternative fuels and standard fuels. And so that's something we need to be really alert to. And it's not a theoretical problem, as the data will show, it's an actual problem already today. So what is the environmental issue that we're trying to address? It's essentially renewable fuels exist primarily to reduce the life cycle carbon dioxide emissions. They do have other ancillary benefits as well, but the primary reason we're pursuing it is for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And so the key question is, how much do they reduce CO2, not in theory, but in practice? The planet doesn't care about theory, it just cares about what actually is emitted. And too many people lose sight of that important distinction. So the question is, not only does an individual fuel reduce CO2, but can it in aggregate at the system level be a material contributor to decarbonisation? There are lots of things that can do a little bit, but actually if they can't scale to take a big chunk out of the overall problem, then maybe we shouldn't bother too much. But in switching to these fuels, we need to be careful we don't reduce climate change, but reintroduce problems of air quality because it makes tailpipe emissions worse. So we need to balance those two things and relate them also to the legal values. Because on some emissions, like carbon monoxide emissions, tailpipes now are incredibly well controlled. So we can actually afford a small increase in carbon monoxide and still be massively below the legal limit. So we do need a pragmatism as well. We need to think about unregulated emissions and overall, what are the impacts on air quality and human health? So there needs to be a materiality and a real impact on real people. If we can emit lots, small amounts of nasty stuff in rural areas, and if it doesn't have any impact, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't worry so much. So we need to have a realism and a pragmatism. Before we dive into data, we do also need to think and sort of define our terms as to what we mean by renewable fuels. And it's not a regulated term, to my knowledge, and it's used to describe a whole bunch of different things, but held together by the idea that they are not fossil fuels. So you have bioethanol, which comes from crops, which is blended into gasoline. That's a very common one. You would have biodiesel, which tends to be a processing of certain fats and blending them into diesel. You get biomethane, biogas, which tends to be from rotting material, organic material, and anaerobic digestion. They are sort of the first gen renewable fuels, but then you get the advanced biofuels. The most common in Europe at the moment is HVO, hydro-treated vegetable oil, that typically takes waste cooking oil, does chemical processing to it, and actually in Germany you can at certain pumps around Germany buy HVO 100, so 100% HVO at the pump at the moment. Not very common, but you can do it. We talked yesterday, there was some talks about hydrogen, green hydrogen, and that is, I would put that within our scope of renewable fuels. And then the one which is held out as the one with the greatest scaling opportunity is synthetic and e-fuels. And I'm conscious that we're standing here today. This is the same day that in Brussels, Ursula von der Leyen is meeting with the European car industry to see if it can save itself. We've been taken down a route of pure electrification, which has got stuck because it turned out to be too difficult and too expensive and too geopolitically difficult. And Germany particularly is pushing for using e-fuels as an alternative, as an additional way of decarbonizing the fleet. The problem with them is the bio components. That all sounds great and lovely, but it changes the combustion characteristics. Could be in a good way, could be in a bad way. What we do know is in most cases the biofuel is lower energy density. So you've got immediately a difference in the efficiency of combustion. So you're burning more of volumetrically of the liquid to get the same energy out. And so the bias, if anything, will be towards increased pollutant emissions. But there are many other substances that are in the fuel, and it leads to an alternative mix of tailpipe pollutants. And you only really know when you try. But that's before you even talk about the upstream part of this, and we need to be really careful that the bio components as sold are really and truly as green as they make out to be, and where they come from, what methods, how far they've been transported even. And verification of that embedded carbon content is difficult. The other part of the fuel challenge, and not to be neglected, is the scalability and the economics. Because this is really only much help to us if we can do this relatively cheaply and at huge scale. And that's the problem with HVO. There's not enough used cooking oil around to really scale HVO in the way it's currently conceived. Unlike synthetic fuel, which theoretically can be produced unlimited scale. And it comes back to our old friend that we were talking about yesterday, the electricity prices, or the low carbon electricity prices, and can we effectively scale that energy backbone of the world? Okay, So we test all these different bits that I talked about, from tailpipe to the fuel itself to the cabin and the tires, and that's the method that we apply. So the first thing we do so think about what we're going to do here. We're going to take a vehicle, we're going to look at the fuel, we're going to chemically analyze what goes into the tank, we're going to burn it, and then we're going to see what comes out of the tailpipe. So and I'm going to just take you through a few results of what we've run. So the backbone of our tailpipe testing is this blue box here, which is called a portable emissions measurement system. It measures CO2, CO, NOx, particles, a whole range of things. It can also do ammonia, heat out 1 hertz, so real-time mass emission, so actual milligrams per second of the pollutant coming out. You can measure, obviously, the distance traveled by the vehicle, so you can derive mass emissions per kilometer driven. And that's the crucial. So it's not just concentrations, it's actually the mass emissions. And this is used in vehicle regulation now in Europe. So it's equipment of really good standing, but to which we've added an extra piece that we developed ourselves, which enables sampling of the raw exhaust onto various thermal desorption and other tubes, which and geofence, so we can put the urban part of the driving on some of the tubes, the motorway bit on another part of the tubes, the cold start bit. And then that enables us at the end of the test to do some very detailed chemical analysis, almost a full VOC speciation, as well as N2O and various other things from that tailpipe. So you've got the regulated emissions using the blue box, and you've got the unregulated emissions using our matrix of tubes and into this 2-dimensional gas chromatography and time of flight mass spectrometry. So a pretty advanced piece of kit, which allows you to take a sample of exhaust gas and really pretty much fully separate, identify, and quantify, again, in mass emissions terms, what was in that tailpipe. So you can see why this is relevant for testing biofuels, that we can see, are we still compliant on the regulated pollutants, but are we introducing any nasty VOCs accidentally? Or are there some additional benefits that we didn't previously know about? The one tricky one that doesn't work using the treatment tubes is formaldehyde, because it's so volatile, but our matrix of tubes does allow for DMPH cartridges, so we can derivatize the formaldehyde and actually measure that as well. Out of the tubes, you then get a lovely 2-dimensional chromatogram with time. The time on the 2 columns is the separator, and this is a real chromatogram. And so you can see from a sample, we can identify hundreds of compounds individually and quantify them. That becomes a bit baffling to get your head round. So we then stick it all back together into various functional groups. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this. The ones we immediately think about are the aromatics, particularly the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and the nitro aromatics as well, where a lot of the carcinogens lie. But there's groups do have their own, sort of broad generic effects. Right. So that's how we do it. So you can imagine vehicle here instrumented with all this stuff. We can actually then drive it on the real road. So this is not a lab. This is in reality. And the first thing we did actually was to look at, and so this is real tests we've run. So the first thing was to do a simple test, a tug on the River Thames in London, and the operator there wanted to know, will this be much better for the environment if we switch from running standard diesel to HVO? What happened? So we got some HVO. The tugboat was pulling 500 tons of payload. This was actually interesting. London was, I think, the first city in the world to do big public sewers, but we did them a long time ago, and they're now too small to cope with the 8 million population of London. So over the last 10 years, London has been building a super sewer along the Thames, which has just opened. It's been fantastic, actually. And this was about removing all the spoil dug out from this tunnel and getting rid of it, because there was a huge amount of stuff. So they wanted to do it in the most environmentally friendly way possible. So as you can see, we went up and down the Thames, moving this spoil. And the ultimate acid test was it better to put it on tugboats and do it out on the river, or to put it on lots and lots of different trucks. So that was why we were doing this, and we wanted to choose the fuel that did it in the most environmentally friendly way possible. So here we've got the result. So you see the B7 diesel, that's the standard diesel, the HVO, you've got fuel consumption, but then CO2, all the key essentially regulate the emissions. And what we can see here is that essentially it was fantastic. HVO was fantastic for NOx reduction, about over a 50% reduction in NOx. And given that's one of the problematic air pollutants in London, that's great. But the particle number, which is also a tailpipe regulated value, you can see almost trebled. So it was still absolutely at actually quite low levels. So it did treble, but it was still not too problematic. So overall, the view was that HVO was a net contributor on balance to emissions reduction. So that's the sort of simple first case of what we can do. Now let's look at it in a little bit more detail and look at what happens with some alternative gasoline. So the first thing is I wanted to show how we can use our chemical approach to understanding the different chemical composition. So here we've taken a very simple comparison, and this is just to illustrate what we can do. So here we've taken a standard diesel and compared it to a premium diesel. Very simple. You can buy these Shell products at the pump today. And this is the power of the 2DGC. Here, we've taken the top compounds that we've identified and we've ranked by their concentration in the sample. And the blue line is the standard diesel, and the V-Power premium diesel is the orange line. And you can see, so in many ways, there's a lot of similarity, but you can immediately identify certain compounds there which are characteristic of essentially the additives that they put in and the slightly different feedstocks that Shell uses in putting together the V-Power. So this is the part where we understand what goes in, and then we put it together with what comes out, and we can start seeing and statistically the sort of patterns between if you change the fuel, what can happen to the exhaust. We do the same. We also did the same. I put this in because we're interested in tires at the moment. People are trying to use pyrolysis of end-of-life tires to create a diesel substitute as well, which is quite an energy-intensive process. So it's not easy to make work. Also, to get the required quality, you see here that the green is overlaid on the previous result. Green is the TPO. So you can see TPO-based diesel is chemically extremely different from standard diesel, and therefore we would expect it to have really big impacts on the tailpipe emissions. And so there's a big debate as to whether that would still be compliant at the tailpipe. And before, sorry, I slightly preempted myself. We haven't quite got to the gasoline results yet, because actually I wanted to say one more thing about the diesel side, which is on the HVO. So we've looked a bit about the chemical composition of it and the tailpipe emissions of it, but what about the provenance side of it? So HVO is meant to be lower CO2 because it substitutes fossil for these waste products. But we can use the 2DGC as well to look at this provenance question. So what we did, we bought 4 different HVOs from the market. So legally sold in the European market, all badged HVO, so all notionally the same. HVO 1, 2, 3, 4. We did the 2DGC chemical speciation of it and compared it to B7 diesel. Now, the null hypothesis is that HVO 1 to 4 are the same. You would have thought there's an ISO standard. It's all regulated. It's all sold by legal companies. But as you can see, and this was the first time we did it, HVO2 stood out like a sore thumb as not the same as HVO 1, 3, and 4. And various different metrics here. So the number of compounds identified, the concentrations of aromatics, PAHs, alkanes, oxygenated compounds. So 1, 3, and 4 were sort of within the range of one another. But HVO2 had much, much higher aromatics in it, much higher oxygenated compounds in it, And our conclusion at the end, and if you compare it to the B7 diesel, our theory was that HVO had been cut about 50% with standard diesel, which classic fraud because of the price differential, dilute it by 50%, make a lot more money. And no surveillance system of any substance exists in Europe to find this, let alone punish it. And that is a problem for the renewable industry, because either this gets found out and credibility gets lost, or it doesn't get found out and we don't have the same benefits for the planet. So either way, we're all losers. So fraud is bad, but the approach we take with the 2DGC is a way of trying to get down. I'm slightly mindful of time. I hope I've only got a few more slides. So do stop me if I run out. As you can see, I'm very passionate about what we do. So I will. Okay, so the final section results is about gasoline. So I mean, the most basic approach to renewable fuels that has happened so far in Europe has been, and in America too, is putting progressively greater amounts of ethanol into standard gasoline, again, to get the upstream CO2 reductions. And they are legal to sell right now, and they are, but the question is, in real world testing, do they still comply? And also, are there any unregulated pollutants that are a problem that we didn't know about? So we took a range of different cars that we tested in the UK, so four cars on our on-road Equa test route, taking in cold start, urban, rural, and motorway, and we looked for regulated pollutants and unregulated. So regulated first, so there was a highly consistent result between the vehicles, and as you can see, by switching from E0, so no ethanol at all, to E10, there was on average a 31% reduction in carbon monoxide, and that was already from low levels, so very good. But there was a 21% increase in NOx. But fortunately, because it's gasoline, that was 21% increase from almost nothing to start with. So yes, an increase, but the interpretation should be not a problem. Certainly not a significant contributor to air quality. So all well below the regulated limits there. I should say, by the way, E10, you probably know, E10 as sold means not 10% ethanol, but up to 10% ethanol. For the purposes of this test, we got specially blended E10, which was actually 10%. So this wasn't just random. Unregulated, and the ones, so we've also had a full speciation of the unregulated, but I'm only going to draw attention to a number of them today. So formaldehyde, other aldehydes, toluene, and nitrous oxide, because of they have particular human health effects and other environmental effects. So these are sort of bellwether compounds, if you like. And so these are the results between and I've itemized out here the 4 different cars that we tested. You can see it's a bit of a mixed picture. On formaldehyde, the overall mean increase was 18%, and the Kia Sportage 1.6 had a particularly big increase in formaldehyde. Other aldehydes were down 20%, but again, a mean of quite a wide spread. Toluene was probably the worst there, with 3 of the 4 showing increases, and the average being a 90% increase. But on the other hand, nitrous oxide was about flat to down in 3 of the cases. Nitrous oxide, by the way, is a problem primarily as a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about 260 times greenhouse gassy than CO2, I think it is. So small amounts of that are bad. And then we can also break down the same results, not by the cars, but by the different parts of the test cycle. So you can see in cold start, actually, the formaldehyde was up the most, but other aldehydes were actually down significantly. Toluene was up consistently, however fast you were driving the car. So that goes to show the power of this test method in terms of the granularity and the real-time data that you can get for both regulated and unregulated. We also did do a similar thing, a similar test, pushing it a little bit further to E20, we did a test program with Volkswagen on roads around Stuttgart in Germany to see if you can push the proportion of ethanol up even further without having any significant problems. And you'll see here that begin to see perhaps a limit of what can be done in terms of the proportionate blending. And I'm looking at our US colleagues who push the proportion of ethanol higher than we do currently. So in this case, we saw when we got up to E20, the carbon monoxide emissions were beginning to increase again, whereas particle number stayed low and the tailpipe CO2 was still improving. Equally, also formaldehyde, and particularly formaldehyde under cold start, was beginning to become a problem, particularly with E20. So, and oxidates, excluding formaldehyde, similarly at E20 becoming a problem. So maybe we were beginning to see the limits of optimally how far you can actually push that. So, in summary, we think that putting these two bits together, what goes in and what comes out, is actually really crucial in understanding the overall picture. And by putting together the PEMS equipment with the two-dimensional gas chromatography, you have a really powerful way of understanding what's happening. And we use these techniques. Don't think of me just as a vehicles guy, though, because we apply a lot of the same techniques to bioplastics, for example. Anything essentially that's where you've got some sort of fossil fuel backbone and we're trying to find bio alternatives. That's the space that we work. And so renewable fuels in this case can make some reductions in regulated pollutants. The devil is in the detail. There are, for some, like the ethanol in gasoline, it may lead to increases in certain aldehydes and hydrocarbons. There is undoubtedly, from supply pressure point of view, a genuine risk of fraud in the supply chain that we need to be very mindful of, but that we can use these sort of fuel fingerprinting techniques to weed that out and to try and preserve the CO2 benefits. And ultimately, renewable fuels, it sounds great, and in many ways it is great, but it does need to be able to demonstrate with a high degree of certainty that those emissions benefits are genuine and true. And if that can be done, then I think there is a healthy future for the market. All our data, by the way, because we own it, is available. So if any of that has piqued your interest, we are very happy to talk to you about how we can provide that. But on that note, thank you very much for listening. I hope that's interesting. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.